Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Hammerheads.
Hello.
This is Marcus Wilson and I'm Miles Watts. And we have previously recorded a YouTube series called Tintin Cast, which went through all the Tintin books, which we're still doing actually. We finished the main Tintin books. We're now going on to the outlying Tintin books. But we just thought, what do we do after Tintin Cast? Something.
And the obvious answer is Hama horror.
Yeah, because there's an obvious link between Tintin and Hama horror. But the sort of inspiration for this was we wanted to do a series that lasted at least, a few months, because we had so much fun doing Tintin Cast over most of last year, which is 2021. So it's kind of a lockdown project, really. But now we're kind of half in, half out of the pandemic, mostly in. We thought we'd do something that was episodic and something that would make us watch and discuss things. And we were looking at the BFI's website, and the BFI did this fantastic thing where they listed 17 Hammer horror movies, one a year from 57 onwards, all the way to well, you work it out, what's 17 74 is it, from the start
74
of the,
yes
74,
which is when we were born.
That's true. Oh, that's really good, actually. Yeah, Marcus and I are both from a small town in Yorkshire called Harrogate. We grew up together, went to school together, both schools together, primary and secondary. And so we're old friends. We've been friends for over 40 years. And we just can't get enough of each other's company. So, we both watch a lot of films, and we grew up together watching horror films and stuff. So this seemed like a natural sort of... It took us a few months to hit upon this idea, didn't it? But the BFI list is 17 movies, one per year, from Hammer Studios. And I don't know about you, Marcus, but I've seen a handful of Hammer movies, but not all of them.
No, I was surprised at how few of them I've actually seen. And in fact, obviously, Hammer encompasses a whole range of other genres beyond the horror, but it's the horror that they're known for, particularly between 57 and 74. And we should say, before we go any further, I mean, my qualifications for talking about horror films are not that great. I mean, I was introduced to horror films at quite an inappropriately young age by my Nana Wiggy. No one really knows why she was called Nana Wiggy, actually. I think
she didn't wear a wig, did she?
She didn't wear a wig. So I think there was something about her being Nana Wilson, but my brother couldn't pronounce Wilson, so he used to say Nana Wiggy.
Oh, that's cute.
Which is quite cute, yeah. But Nana Wiggy, I used to go around to her house and stay with her at the weekend, and so my mum could get a bit of time away from me. And so this was around sort of 7, 8, 9 years old. She would allow me she'd like feed me milk and biscuits and plonk me down in front of the television and let me stay up till really inappropriately late hours of the night on Saturdays. And back then, I guess we're talking like early 80s, I think it was BBC Two in the UK was showing each Saturday night, usually horror pictures, which my nana would let me stay up and watch. And sometimes it was also just very inappropriate kind of kitchen sink dramas. Like I remember staying up very late and seeing something like the Day and the Death of Joe Egg or something.
Oh, yeah.
Which was this like not really something for an 8-year-old.
No.
It was sort of all of those things that your parents protect you from the kind of big bad adult world. And then obviously my nana would go to sleep in the couch, and she would wake up and see me watching something that was entirely inappropriate, like nude female vampires or something like this, and kind of quickly kind of shuffle and say, right, time to go to bed.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that your nana actually got you into horror movies. That's incredible.
And it was, I suppose it was that really impressionable age where you're kind of not really, the kind of blurring of the lines between what is fact, what is fiction, what is drama, what is reality. It's like an age where you're not kind of get to grips with all of that stuff. So I think it probably affected me kind of quite badly, probably. But I remember asking my mum in the car one day when the world turned from black and white to color, because obviously I was watching some black and white films, some color films, particularly some of these very garishly kind of colorful films, which we'll talk about in relation to the film we're talking about today. And I just assumed that the world used to be in black and white, and then one day it turned into color. So I kind of
I think
asked around.
everybody did. I think
Is that
everyone
right?
thinks, and I think it's exemplified by things like World War II in color, where,
Yeah.
those documentaries where you see Hitler and the Nazis sort of marching on Paris in color, and you're like, of course this was in color,
Yes.
living horrific color. So yeah, I mean, it's you and I think we both went to see a couple of horror movies together at the Harrogate Odeon. We must have done. I've
Yes.
got a couple of memories. I think you and I went to see Friday the 13th, the final one.
Mm.
Was it Friday the 13th? No, Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare, which is in 3D.
It was 3D. Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that.
You
Yeah.
and I went to, which is 91, I think. So you and I went to see that. But previously, yeah, in the 80s, yeah. So I grew up in a cul-de-sac. I had a next door neighbor called Pete, whose dad used to record stuff off the telly and rent stuff. And so I was allowed to go to Pete's house, and Pete's dad let us watch horror movies. So I remember things like The Hand with Michael Caine, and some slightly lesser ones like Gremlins. I don't mean lesser films. I mean less horror, less overt horror. And then Neil Bolton, who was a mutual friend of ours from primary school, do you remember? He and his mum used to let us rent really hardcore horror movies like The Fly, Hellraiser, RoboCop. So I remember going to Neil's and seeing these movies. I was about 12, 13, and Aliens, stuff like that. And it really affected me. I mean, I absolutely loved them for a start.
It's
But they messed
always
me
an
up.
inappropriate adult, isn't it? But
Oh, completely. It's always it's the cool parent or relative of a friend or something that lets you watch it. Because I think my mum would have been appalled that Mandy Bolton let us rent things like Hellraiser and The Fly and stuff. The Fly, I remember, particularly messed me up.
Well, it must have affected me at the kind of early age, 8, 9, or whatever I was, because I remember going home, and during the week, we had this airing cupboard between my bedroom and the bathroom. And I think probably for about 3 years, I thought that there was some creature living in that airing cupboard. So I refused to go and brush my teeth at night on my own. So I think I didn't brush my teeth for about 3 years. So, and that's it. Well, if that's the extent of the damage that it did, yeah, maybe it's not too bad.
I can also remember going to your house to see things like The Young Ones, because my parents didn't really approve of The Young Ones because they thought it was vulgar. So yeah, it was always other people's houses where I watched stuff that was considered contraband by my parents. I mean, they weren't draconian or anything, but they wouldn't really want me watching that kind of thing. And then when they certainly wouldn't rent it for me, and then when I was a bit older, things like Movie Drome was on telly, so you could see things like American Werewolf in London at midnight on BBC Two. That's where I really started racking up the horror movie viewings. But I think, yeah, with Pete next door, we rented all the Friday the 13th movies, all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, the Evil Dead, that kind of thing. So it was video nasties.
But we should say that you are obviously much more qualified to talk about this than I am, being a filmmaker in the horror genre.
That is true. I am a horror filmmaker and very proud of it. And I keep going back to the horror genre because it's, first of all, it's cheap when you're starting out. So yeah, we made our zombie web series Zomblogalypse from 2008 to 2011. And then we made the movie a couple of years ago, which is out this year on streaming and disc, which is great. It's called Zomblogalypse, and Whoops, which is about a serial killer. So yeah, I do tend to write in the horror genre and bring to bear my considerable influence from all these new films I watched when I was a kid, way too young.
Well, it would be very interesting to explore that over the next few podcasts. In fact, the main thing I remember just before the pandemic lockdown happened is we'd just been to see the cast and crew premiere of your film Zomblogalypse in a little cinema in Thirsk in the north of England, and you had enlisted a number of zombies to be there at the cinema. Not real zombies, I don't believe, but yes, actors dressed as a zombie. It was great, actually. He turned up at the cinema, and these zombies were sort of like banging on the window to get out. It was quite an event.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was thinking, people would sometimes say, "Why are you so obsessed with zombies?" And I think it happened very, very slowly and organically with me because I didn't see the Evil Dead films properly till in the 90s when they started coming out on video. And I didn't really get into zombies until probably Shaun of the Dead, actually. So I'd seen Dawn of the Dead, quite liked it, but Shaun of the Dead came out and also Spaced as well. And they just kept referencing Dawn of the Dead and Romero, and I went, I'm going to have to go back and rewatch these films, and so I did, and I just completely got hooked. And that led to us doing Zomblog. So that's what led to that, really. But yeah, I hadn't seen a lot of Hammer movies, so I think we're using this as our education, really. Like we want to go through, and we figured this BFI list was as good a place to start as any. There's 17 Hammer horror movies to watch over the next few months. And we just thought, you know what, let's just do that one a year from 57 to 74 and just take it all in. And
I should say we're not doing one episode a year. We're watching one film that was made each year between 1957 and 1974.
Yes, otherwise it's a bit lazy doing one podcast episode a year. We won't really build up an audience that way, will we? But it's, as a filmmaker and a film fan, I always feel like there's more and more films to watch. I need to fill in gaps in my film watching, and Hammer is a gap. It's a big gap. I've probably, out of these 17 films, I've probably seen about 5. A couple of the Dracula ones, and I think I've seen more Amicus movies than I have Hammer, which is another story entirely.
Yes, and another podcast series, maybe.
Yeah, potentially, yes. But it's an excuse for Marcus and I to watch all these Hammer movies because, Hammer is unavoidable when you're into movies, and especially horror. And it just, this period, 57 to 74, is this fascinating period of film history. It's pre-Star Wars, it's during Romero, and it's after the 40s when, post-war was sort of, things were gearing back up again after the war. So it is a fantastic sort of fertile period of film.
Yeah, and we can explore the time a lot more because I think that there's a lot to be said about that stuff as well. I mean, the name, the word Hammer, just kind of conjures all kinds of things, and I just assumed it was, it's synonymous with the horror of the studios during these years, but it's actually just named after a guy called William Hines who came from Hammersmith, and he was a businessman and owned jewelry stores, and he'd appeared as a comedian in vaudeville shows, I think. And he had the stage name Will Hammer because he came from Hammersmith. And that's why Hammer Productions is called Hammer Productions. And that was formed back in 1934.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's got this brilliant just Britishness to it. These days the British film industry is a lot of things. It isn't a lot of things. Back then, Hammer was this huge movement in British film. It had all these amazing stars in it, which we'll go into. And it just filled this gap between what became the video nasty slasher serial killer market, which is now huge and became huge in the 80s. And it just fits in this nice little pocket of history, Hammer movies, but they're just a fascinating bunch of films from all aspects. And we've just watched the first one. It was actually the first Hammer movie we've just watched, because it's the 65th anniversary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 60th anniversary of this film, The Curse of Frankenstein, and this was Hammer Studios, Hammer Productions' first foray into horror. Before this, they'd sort of dallied with all kinds of things, historical fiction, science fiction, a lot in sort of early 50s, but this was the first attempt by the studio to reanimate the films of the sort of the Universal Studios, the monster movies of earlier in the century.
And they wanted to do them in color specifically, didn't they? So this is the first color one.
Yeah, this is the first Hammer film in color, but it's also the first Frankenstein film ever to be shot in color.
I'm a big fan of the James Whale ones.
Yes.
Bride of Frankenstein and Frankenstein from the 30s. Absolutely iconic I also love Young Frankenstein by Mel Brooks. But this one, I admittedly had not seen until today, which is a perfect example of how novice we are at Hammer movies and why we're going on this journey of discovery. I've read the book, seen various adaptations, hadn't seen this one before.
Yeah, I don't think I'd seen this one before, and maybe with Nana Wiggy, back in 1981 or something. But yeah, there was a really old Hammer sorry, an old version of Frankenstein by Edison Studios, Edison Productions, back in
Yes.
1910. There's sort of a black and white short where I suppose they're using it to experiment with different camera effects. So there's lots of sort of reverse films and visual illusions, I guess, to show off what they can do with in cinematography. That was
Yeah.
kind of interesting watching that. It's only like a 20-30 minute thing.
Yeah, and then the James
Silent.
Whale one is obviously, it's this
Ah,
beautiful black and white
Karloff.
iconic movie. Karloff plays the monster.
Yeah.
It's been copied by everybody since. It's been a huge influence on everybody. But the 57 version by Hammer is not really anything to do with that. And the creators have said they deliberately ignored previous versions and just wanted to do their version.
Well, I think some of that was to do with Universal still owning the copyright to various things. So, for instance, the Boris Karloff makeup, the bolts in the neck and things like that, they weren't allowed to recreate that because that would have breached copyright on the makeup. And they weren't, in fact, allowed to call Frankenstein's monster a monster because that would have breached their copyright in the film as well. So I think they refer to it as a creature.
And they also say the man I created.
Yeah.
I mean, let's go into the cast, shall we? Because you've got Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein. And Peter Cushing is just one of the finest gentlemen who ever lived. I think everyone knows who Peter Cushing was. If they've seen Star Wars, they'll know him as Governor Tarkin, the evil sort of emperor underdog who's in charge of Darth Vader, actually, and in charge of the Death Star. That's the first time I knew Peter Cushing was. So inevitably, whenever Peter Cushing came up, I'd be like, Star Wars, being a huge Star Wars fan. But then when you watch some of his films, you realize, I mean, let's just stick to this one for now, Curse of Frankenstein. He is incredible in it. He is this, driven, he's straight out of the book, really. He's a driven, monstrous character who is very charming, well turned out, but crazy scientist with gadgets everywhere. And, he's obsessed with creating a creature, well, a human. He wants to create the perfect human with the perfect mind, perfect body, all this. And there's a great moment later on where his friend's like, oh, this is your perfect human, is it? Perfect human specimen.
He's kind of the creature's kind of drooling and kind of stumbling about.
So I think this is a really fantastic showcase for Peter Cushing from start to finish. I think he's an amazing Victor Frankenstein. And did you notice who played young Victor?
Yes, I did. It's Gunnar Gloria Bowman from 1970s. It Ain't Half Hot Mum. And if you grew up in the UK in the 70s, you'll know that to be a slightly inappropriate comedy. Gunnar Bowman was a particularly camp character, wasn't he?
He was. Melvin Hayes was the actor. Yeah,
Hayes, that's right.
It took me a while. I went, oh yeah, he's it. And so Peter Cushing is, this very precocious young man who hires.
He is, isn't he? He reminds me actually of in the Magnificent Ambersons, George Amberson, like that real kind of precocious young. You kind of know as soon as you meet the character actually that he's going to get his comeuppance. It's like that comeuppance thing from the Magnificent Ambersons. He's a great character though.
Very precocious, and you think this guy is almost like a Wes Anderson type character, where you think this guy is 20 years too old for his age. He's a teenager and so he hires this guy who becomes his best friend, and I want to create a human from other dead body parts. But the great thing about this movie for me is that when it starts, they bring a puppy back to life. And there's this thing as a website called doesthedogdie.com, and it's something I check regularly because as a dog owner and very much a dog person, I can't stand it in horror movies. And there's a lot where the dog is only there, or the cat is only there to be killed off and found dead or experimented on. Or so I regularly have to check this website, doesthedogdie.com, to see if the dog dies, because if it does, I will seriously consider not watching that movie.
Oh, okay. Well, I think this is one movie that the opposite happens.
Exactly.
The dog is brought to life.
Exactly. The dog starts off dead and is brought to life. It's a puppy, and nothing bad happens to it. So if you're into dogs, watch this movie. They bring a puppy to life at the beginning. And off it trots. It's everything that happens after that's bad.
Yes, I do like Victor's partner in crime, although he's only his partner in crime very briefly at the start. Paul is his tutor that he enlists himself once his parents have both died and he's inherited. So he pays for Paul to be his tutor. And Paul is played by a Robert Urquhart.
Urquhart. Urquhart.
Urquhart.
Oh, of course, you're referencing a local hero, of course. Yeah, I should have got that straight away. Of course, Urquhart.
And he's a good Highlander. And apparently, Robert Urquhart was he attended the premiere of the film, was so disgusted with what they'd done at Hama Studios that he pretty much stormed out and said he'd never act in a horror or Hama film ever again, which is kind of weird because he was pretty much in every scene where there was any gore or any kind of horrible stuff happening. So I don't know why he would have left it to the premiere to kind of
that's weird,
suddenly throw his toys out of the pram on that one. But
he wanted to have a hissy fit, clearly, didn't he, and make a big show of it. But he's very good in it. The lad who plays Paul, and he is kind of acts as Victor's conscience, doesn't he?
He does, and he looks a bit like Russell Crowe. Did you notice that?
He does look like Russell Crowe. You're right, yes. And no, not till you mentioned it then. But yes, Victor, very quickly unravels. He's very charming, and he wears these lovely clothes, and he has lovely hair, and he's a very handsome young Peter Cushing.
Well, you say young Peter Cushing. I've never thought of Peter Cushing as being young. He's always seemed to me just this aging, sinister old horror character, and in this film he's actually about 5 years younger than we are now. So
yes, he is. He's in his 40s, isn't he? Yeah. So, but I think I always think of Peter Cushing as old and cheekboney and sallow.
He was always cheekboney.
He was always cheekboney.
I like that he's. There's one scene I just can't get my head around the notion of Peter Cushing just having a laugh, and I'm sure he seems to have been a very nice guy, but I can't imagine him just having a laugh. There's one scene actually in the film where the scene just starts with they're at a sort of dinner party and Peter Cushing's just kind of chuckling about something, but obviously you've not heard what they're chuckling about. He's just it feels quite forced.
Yes.
act laughing, and then obviously he goes into saying something very sinister straight after that. So
yes.
I don't know, does anybody, this would be an interesting one to ask the listeners, do they know of a film where Peter Cushing is just having a bit of a laugh?
I can only think of one clip of him having a laugh, which is from Star Wars Outtake.
Oh, right.
Where he and Carrie Fisher, because Carrie Fisher had to call him all kinds of horrible names. I recognized your foul stench, that kind of thing. And he flubs his lines and he just laughs his head off. And apparently he was the most charming guy. Carrie Fisher had a problem being mean to him because he was just too nice.
I can imagine him being very nice. I just can't imagine Peter Cushing having a bit of a laugh. In the way that I can imagine Christopher Lee having a bit of a laugh.
Well, that's when you hear Christopher Lee talking about Peter Cushing, obviously they had a very long brotherhood that lasted, 30, 40 years, and they loved each other a lot. And Christopher Lee would say, Peter and I had the big laughs, and you'd be like,
really?
Yeah, I know. I'd love to have been there when that happened. Because Christopher Lee, obviously very imposing, serious man, and Peter Cushing is obviously very serious. But yeah, apparently they shared very inappropriate humor a lot. And
and they met on this film, which is very heartwarming. Apparently they'd acted in films prior to this, but they were never in the same scenes. But so they met each other on this film.
Oh, it's so nice.
Yeah.
It's a brotherhood that lasts, as like ours, Marcus.
Indeed.
We met in whatever it was, 1981, 82,
That's right. On
um,
the set of
on the set of West End School, Harrogate. Yes,
yes.
which is sadly slash happily no longer with us.
Horrific though it was.
It was. We survived primary school, didn't we? We got a good education though. So yeah, and yes, the creature in this film is played by Christopher Lee, and interestingly, this is sort of like a zombie film because they're bringing something back to life, and obviously Mary Shelley, who we haven't mentioned yet, which is disgraceful. Mary Shelley, the mother of modern science fiction. Um, she wrote the book. It's amazing. It's an amazing book. If you haven't read it, really should, because the movie adaptations are all interesting to a degree, one degree or another. But the book is just it's just phenomenal, and
It's very different, isn't it? I mean, it's very
very
different from the book. I mean, it's very different from James Whale's film.
yeah
It's very different from the book. And I mean, there's reasons for that. Obviously, the Universal Studio copyright thing with Boris Karloff and the creature and stuff. But Hammer had other more financial considerations, I think, because their budgets weren't huge.
yeah
They had this studio, Bray Studios, which was just like a kind of country house near London, and they used that pretty much as the backdrop of all of their films around this time. So whatever the action, it had to be kind of encompassed within this Bray Studios. So whatever they could get Bray Studios to look like, essentially.
yeah
And so all of the stuff about I think in Mary Shelley's book, a lot of action happens out on the ice floes going towards the North Pole, where Frankenstein's chasing his creation towards the North Pole, and obviously all of that had to be just written out of this. So instead of that, and Frankenstein's confession, I think, is to the ship's captain in Shelley's novel, whereas in this, Frankenstein's basically awaiting to be taken to the guillotine because he is thought to have murdered the housekeeper, Justine. And so he asks the burgomaster of the town in Switzerland to come along to be his confessor almost, because he wants to get it off his chest, or at least for someone to know what a bright and brilliant person he is for having created life. And then it was that monster that went on to kill Justine. So and it really reminded me, actually, or I was reminded of Peter Schaffer's Amadeus, because that film is bookended in exactly the same way. I mean, it's a storytelling, a narrative device that you've got basically Frankenstein wanting to tell his story to the burgomaster at the start, and then you get all of the flashbacks for the film. And the same thing happens in Amadeus, where you've got he invites the priest along, and the priest thinks he's there to be a confessor, and actually, he's confessing to the hatred of Mozart and how he thinks he killed Mozart. So I just wondered if Peter Schaffer had any influence from this film, or the structure of this film.
It's funny, I didn't think of Amadeus. I did think of The Fly, funnily enough, both versions, the 50s version and the 80s version, because it's a similar thing. There's a monster, sure, a monster's created, but in The Fly, the monster is the hero. When Elizabeth later on goes to the lab and she's there and the monster's lurking in the window, it just reminded me of The Fly when he jumps down and vomits on John Getz's arm. And those sets are phenomenal. But what it also reminded me of, it reminded me of a zombie movie, and it's one of the sort of early. It's more like a zombie movie, and I know Frankenstein is technically a zombie because he's come back from the dead. But there was the first zombie movie, I think, and I could be wrong about this, and I should know this as a zombie filmmaker, was I Walk with a Zombie from 1943, where the zombie is more like I think it's a Haitian voodoo cult that brings slaves back, brings people back from the dead as slaves, and they're zombies. Whereas in the 60s, Romero did with Night of the Living Dead, it was more like they've risen from the dead, they bite people, those people become zombies. So Frankenstein's sort of in the middle. This version is anyway, where he's created this zombie and the zombie's killing people. But Day of the Dead. This super reminded me of Day of the Dead from 1985, the Romero one, because there's a mad doctor in that experimenting on the zombies in the lab.
Yes.
And he's got all this crazy, and everyone just, what are you doing? You training them to do this, that, and the other. And the bub, that amazing zombie in Day of the Dead, he teaches him to salute and listen to music and all this kind of. It reminded me of a little bit of a hybrid of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the makeup obviously is kind of green. The Christopher Lee creature looks a bit like a zombie David Bowie with his mismatching eyes and stuff.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I wondered if, like, and unlike the Mary Shelley novel, where the monster, the creature, learns how to talk by living with a blind man and sort of hiding and overhearing English lessons and or I guess German lessons, I guess it was Switzerland, but they were in Mary Shelley's novel. The monster is very sympathetic, but won't shut up. I mean, he just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
And thing about this movie is obviously the monster is mute, which puts him more into that zombie genre, I guess.
Yeah, he's a servant of the. But I love the fact that Victor Frankenstein has always fascinated me as a character, because whatever version you go with, James Whale one or even the Kenneth Branagh one from the 90s, which is a terrific production. Actually, it's incredibly operatic, and I think the screenwriter. Now, was it Frank Darabont or something? I'm gonna have to look that up. But the screenwriter of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by Kenneth Branagh ended up saying what Branagh did was make it very operatic and over the top and stuff. But I actually really love that about Branagh's version. It's this frantic. I've always loved Victor Frankenstein as this mad, obsessed, creative monster who can't, and I think Mary Shelley obviously set this up as a man who can't or won't have children, basically. And so he's decided to play God instead.
Well, that's really interesting, because Terence Fisher, the director, as well, said that he wanted to play it that Frankenstein was the monster and his creature was, just a creature. And there is a bit in it as well where Victor is so much about creating this perfect specimen, whereas Paul, his teacher and partner, is thinking about, how can we use this this discovery for good? How do we bring back people's loved ones from the dead? How do we, and Victor's, no, we don't want to tell anyone about this. We were going to just create this supermensch type thing. So that's was really interesting. And then there's a bit in the film where Justine, obviously Frankenstein is portrayed by Cushing as a man with sort of wandering hands, not just the hands in the lab, but with Justine and his cousin Elizabeth, who I don't think is his real cousin. There was an American podcast going on about this the other day, and we're getting kind of very upset that he was sleeping with his cousin. I think she is an adopted cousin,
right?
Or at least she is in the novel.
It's not like Jerry Lee Lewis, where it was like his
no.
second cousin twice removed.
But there's a scene in the film where Justine comes to him and says, "Look, I'm pregnant. You got me pregnant. I'm going to tell the village," and stuff like that. And he isn't interested at all in his own child, and he basically tells her to go away and that she's probably slept with everyone in the village.
Yes.
But he has no interest in his own children, whether he can have children or not.
That's something that's fascinating about the character of Frankenstein is, in the book and all the film versions, it's like, why don't you just stop trying to prove you can create life? Because, and I love the fact that the book's written by a woman. Women can create life. They can have babies. Men, they contribute, but men, it's almost like, she created Victor to be this man who was just trying to be a creator of life, and it's like, but men can't create life that way. It's, you have to have a certain natural thing happen,
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that Mary Shelley is talking about these things so early on, because Frankenstein for me almost sits in this genre of fiction with other other novels and films like Jekyll and Hyde
Yeah.
or Portrait of Dorian Gray, which are very much,
Mm.
Victorian creations, but they all talk about this sort of doubling of man, man's alter ego, and very much stuff coming out of the, I guess, psychoanalysis of European, Freud and stuff in the Victorian, UK, British, Victorian era. And obviously Frankenstein predates this by about 100 years. And Mary Shelley was talking about all of this stuff way before those other
She
fictions.
was way ahead of her time, absolutely way ahead of her time. And in the shadow of, of Shelley, who's doing his own thing, she comes out with this. And I think this is why she's a real feminist icon, is because she gave birth to sci-fi. While Shelley was off writing his poems and stuff, she created this absolute, in modern parlance, absolute banger of a story.
And she obviously had her own losses in her life as well, which might explain, thinking about bringing someone back to life, or but equally this seems to have come from almost a storytelling competition that they had in Switzerland, where they were all sort of sitting around the fire trying to spook each other out with ghost stories.
Yeah, well, that's where all the best stories start, isn't it? Or they're serialized, or they're told as ghost stories, or so forth. But there's an absolutely hilarious cut, and I'm sure it's deliberate, where it cuts from Peter Cushing, and he's, Justine's getting molested by the creature, and he leaves her to it. He's like, oh, well, I'll just hard cut to him having tea with Elizabeth and going, more marmalade. And it's just that it shows you how callous Frankenstein is. He's like, I'll just leave that woman just to get murdered by the creature I created while I have tea with this woman and try and, seduce her. But it's funny.
It is. I mean, the script is very, very good. I mean, it's very well constructed, and for a movie of its time in the sort of mid-50s, it's quite sophisticated storytelling, I think. I mean, after both the First and the Second World War, movies seemed to be able to shock a bit more. The censor seemed to be a bit less, after the horrors of war, I guess the censor was a bit less scissor happy. And so, I mean, in the 50s, you get these great sort of films coming out, 40s and 50s, you get these great films coming out of the States, which were kind of quite adult themes and quite scandalous. And, the Hama horror sort of hitting with these garish blood red colors in Eastman Panavision, or whatever it is.
Eastman color, I think, wasn't it? And but Jimmy Sangster was the writer. He did a lot of the Hammer films, and he was one of the big creative forces in the Hammer studio. Jimmy Sangster, he did Dracula, and he did a lot of the future ones. And he was only about 30, I think, when he did this one. But I was impressed with the film as a whole. I thought it was very seminal. I was watching it going, this reminds me of so many other films, and I know films that have been influenced by it are Frankenweenie, both the short and the feature by Tim Burton. I'm sure Rocky Horror was influenced by it, because the bandaged figure in the vat of liquid, they used that in Rocky Horror with the mad scientist and some of the equipment and stuff. And the sets were fantastic. And it's a very simple story. Like even if you know that, what was refreshing about it, even if you know the story of Frankenstein, even if you haven't read the book, but you've seen the film, or kind of what Frankenstein's about. He's the guy with the bolts, you watch this version and it's a fresh telling of the story. And it's 65 years old, this film. It feels fresh. It feels simple. It's a simple version of the story.
Frankenstein is a very different Frankenstein in this as well, isn't he? Because in the book, as soon as Frankenstein's confronted by his creation, he's immediately disgusted with what he's done. He sort of sees the errors of his ways immediately, and the rest of the book is the fallout from that. Whereas this, Cushing's like, yeah, this is good. He's not very bright. He can't say anything. He doesn't do much, but
he smells a bit, but he's got a heart of gold. Yeah, and then I mean the way he gets the brain as well. I mean
Oh,
he invites one of his dear old friends round who's not got any mates, and he pushes him off the balcony before bedtime. And Paul is absolutely horrified because he knows what he's done. And
look out,
then
Professor! Look out!
he
As he's
attacks
pushing
him,
him
and
over the balcony.
yeah, look out, Professor! Boom! Oh, you're dead. Paul comes into the lab and attacks, Frankenstein's creation. He's like, "Oh, Frankenstein's like, I hope you haven't damaged the brain." And then, when the monster first emerges, the first thing it does is like try and kill. It looks at him as if it knows what he's done and goes, "You bastard," and tries to strangle him, lifts him off the ground, and Paul has to come in and break it up.
Well, that's the beauty, both, I guess, of Carlos, his acting in the James Whale version, and of Christopher Lee here. That all of this has to, because these are played as mute characters. So
yeah,
it all has to be done with a kind of look in the eye, or just a movement, and they're both so brilliant at that. I mean, for Christopher Lee to do this performance as quite a young actor, I guess. And then the next year to inhabit an entirely different role as Dracula. I mean, that's
absolutely. I mean, you look at like Peter Cushing, who we all love dearly. You watch him as Van Helsing.
Yeah,
and he's a hero, and he's saying, we must catch the vampire, and we must kill it, and even in something like The Beast Must Die, he's this sort of venerable old genius, looking for the monster, the dogged looking for the monster. But in this, he's an absolute git. He's an absolute mad, monstrous man. And Christopher Lee, who played this character, and then the next year plays Dracula, which is a defining role, and he's so sexy and alluring and striking in that. And in this, he looks like he's just covered in porridge, but he still manages to do an amazing job. Like when Frankenstein's like, sit down, stand up, he sells it, Christopher Lee. And Peter Cushing sells the plea at the end in the jail to Paul, please tell him what I did, tell him it wasn't me. It's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Peter Cushing, again, it's just a brilliant sort of virtuoso performance, and Christopher Lee is just so pathetic as the monster, but just brilliant. He's got such presence.
It's really perfectly pitched, because it could be slightly hysterical or kind of ridiculous, but both of them, both Cushing and Christopher Lee, are just so they just inhabit the characters.
They do. I mean, it's borderline. Like, they know what the borderline is, those two in this film, of histrionics and when it's funny. I nearly laughed at one point with the monster, but then he was so scary and pathetic.
Yeah.
And I didn't laugh. I was like, oh God, no, actually, if I was in that room, I'd be terrified.
And that's the thing about Frankenstein. I think you have to feel for the creation, don't you?
Yeah.
You have to have some depth there to feel that there is a human trying to get out.
Well, I think in all versions, Dr. Frankenstein is the monster, and what it's like you were saying with Jekyll and Hyde and Dorian Gray, it's about the hidden monstrosity of man, specifically man, and how wrong man can go when he starts to play God and start lording it over other humans and thinking he's above them. And I think it's just a really solid, it's got everything in it, this film. It's only 82 minutes. It's very brief. It's very quick. But it feels like you've watched something with a bit of gravitas.
There's nothing, I don't think there's anything you'd cut, is there? I mean, it feels pretty tight.
Apparently they cut 2 scenes for censorship. One was when he cuts down the body off the gibbet. But it's in the version you can get now. But I don't think the acid bath, because at the end he pushes the monster into an acid bath, sets him on fire, pushes him in an acid bath.
That's an amazing stunt, actually. At the end, that's
pluff.
That's Jock Easton was the stuntman, and he's sort of on fire, and he smashes through the glass into this acid bath. Actually, if you watch the film, you can actually see the stuntman after he's fallen into the water, and he sort of stays there for about 2 seconds, and then you can see his arms sort of flailing around while they're fading into the next scene.
I mean, how do you even consider jumping off a roof into a bath of water? I mean,
it's sure health and safety would allow it. I don't think the budget was large enough to have done that properly.
No, but I mean, it's one of those films that it's 65 years old. The special effects are really good.
The lab
They,
looks amazing
the lab is incredible. All his equipment is
with the
incredible.
colors in particular.
Yeah, beautiful color. The color is the version you can get now on Blu-ray is just really gorgeous. And yeah, it's the production design is incredible. It's clearly very stagey. It's on a sound
Mm.
stage. It's all a set, apart from when they go down the woods, which is a nice cheap. It's probably the woods outside the studio. But yeah, it's beautifully done. And it does feel very gothic. It feels very, because Mary Shelley's book is a gothic story. It feels very, very scary, and it feels very. There's a chase at the end. There's rooftops. There's great big gothic house. It just feels it's got everything in it, and the very red blood. I mean, they went through a phase horror movies of having very, 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 very red blood just to show that it was in color.
Yeah.
Then they toned it down a bit in the 70s, 60s, 70s, maybe just to show that it was a bit more realistic. But then, of course, films like Romero's films brought the blood back to being very red again.
Well, it's very, I guess the Giallo films
Giallo, yeah.
would have taken an influence from this, and Dario Argento is very kind of similar in style.
Definitely, and I was introduced to Dario Argento movies from my girlfriend Vicky. I was into Romero, she's into Argento because she loves arty horror movies. So she showed me Suspiria, years ago for the first time, and then she's just she bought me Deep Red recently. And yeah, I love that arty, over the top, beautiful. And actually just watched Edgar Wright's latest movie last night in Soho, which is a sort of modern giallo. And the lights, the filters, the red and the blue and the green and stuff. It's just, I love that style of filmmaking. But obviously this isn't that, but it's definitely an influence on future movies.
And we should also talk about the women of Hammer horror as well, because this film, I think, introduces Hazel Court as
Yes.
an actress who went on then to be in a number of the Hammer films, and I think in some of the American horror films of the 50s and 60s.
Now, is she the one who's constantly getting bitten on the neck by Christopher Lee in the Dracula movie?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Because she plays cousin Elizabeth in this, of course, and
yes.
Actually the girl, the young Elizabeth that gets to make an appearance at the start, they were trying to look for a kind of Hazel Court young lookalike, but they couldn't find one, so they actually used Hazel Court's real daughter, I think. For
no
that.
way! Oh, that's cool.
So
and do you know who was originally going to play the monster before Christopher Lee?
Oh yes, was it Bernard?
Oh, yes, Bernard Bresslaw.
From
Carry On. Yeah, so he would have been like lumbering around. All right, Sid, I'm going to eat you. Hey, look at these birds. Yeah, lovely Bernard Bresslaw.
Oh gosh.
But yes, Christopher Lee got his break instead, and that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, wasn't it? But
probably just as well.
Yeah, yes, I can't imagine Bernie Bresslaw in it. I mean, he's very imposing character, very tall, with a heavy face, didn't he? But
yes, I mean the film apparently cost only £65,000 to make, and I'm not sure what that would be in today's money. Do you have any idea what kind of budget that would be for?
Well, £65,000 is about what we had to make Whoops, which was my third feature.
Yes.
And it's not very much money now. Back then, it probably would have been the equivalent of like about $500,000.
Right. Okay.
Maybe $1 million. In that you could hire some good actors, you could get some good sets going, you could get, obviously inflation's driven everything up now, but yeah, maybe it's a sort of 1 million quid movie, I guess.
Okay, because although it cost £65,000 to make, apparently it went on to make 70 times that amount.
I mean, that's living the dream, isn't it?
That's pretty good. And this is why Hammer stuck to that winning formula for the next 15 years.
Yeah, and we've got some amazing movies to come. I mean, the next one is the Dracula movie, possibly the best Dracula movie. So I'm really looking forward to that one. But really enjoyed Curse of Frankenstein. I thought I would find it a little bit kitsch, a little bit dated, a little bit amusing, but actually came away thinking that is pretty solid. I like that one.
I did. I was very impressed, I have to say.
Yeah. Dracula was the next one, 1958. So that's the next one we'll be studying. So if you listen to this podcast and in sort of early May when it's going out, you'll probably have a couple of weeks to catch up and watch Dracula before we, get our teeth into it.
I like what you did there.
But yeah, that's about all we've got to say about Curse of Frankenstein. I think it's a really solid first horror movie from Hama.
Watch it.
You can see, I think you can rent it, but you can definitely buy it on Blu-ray for a few quid. It's well worth it if you're a fan of horror or just really good genre movies.
Good stuff. Excellent.
Yay.
Thanks for that.
Fangs. No, we can't say that this week.
Oh,
what could we say this week? What's a Frankenstein related pun? We've got to bolt.
I like
God.
it.
Can we promise not to make more puns like this in future episodes?
Join us next time to find out.
Yes, and if you like it, please tell your friends and like and subscribe and all that. And check out Tintin Cast as well, because we enjoy yakking about many subjects, including Tintin.
That's over on YouTube.
Yes, but thank you for tuning in. If you've got this far, well done.
Catch you next time.
Toodles.